Hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to this PhD defense of our work entitled Carbon Cycle as Affected by Soil Erosion in Europe. I'm FENDRICH. In the top right you can see the institutions that made this work possible by supporting it and by funding it. And before jumping into the contents of the presentation, I would like to thank everyone for being here today, especially my supervisors, Philippe, Emmanuel, and Marco. That's helped me a lot during these 3 years. And also the jury members, Christine, Julia, Olivier, Pierre, and Timothy, for accepting to read our work, to review it, and to make comments that will contribute to its final version. So this presentation will be organized like this. I will start with a brief contextualization of where our work is inserted, and then this will lead to the objectives that are the questions that guided the development of the works inside the thesis. And then I will have about 10 minutes for each of the chapters. And I will finish by mentioning the limitations of our approach and future works that can derive from what we did. So first, contextualization. We all know that climate change is a global problem, and researchers try to attack this problem in multiple ways. And one of these ways is by understanding Earth processes and how they affect and how they are affected by climate change. However, there is a challenge in the realm of environmental sciences that standard scientific experimentation is not possible at the large scale. So in some domains, when you have very small scales or depending on the conditions, you can have your treatment or control, you can observe the outcomes. But this is not possible when you talk about a continental scale or global scale simulation. So the solution for that, researchers often have numerical models for physical processes, and in these models they incorporate theoretical aspects and observations that are made in the field. And here in the left you can see an example of a climate model. So we have the compartments for the mountains, land, and ocean. We have the exchange of heat, radiation, the exchange of water to rainfall, the exchange of gases in the 3D grid box. And if we take a closer look at the land compartment, where our work is inserted, we have these sub-processes for the land. So we have the representation of the carbon cycle, the phenology of crops, of forests, the photosynthesis, so the storage of carbon, and also the interference by humans, so management of forests, of croplands, harvest, also fires, land use. And these models, these sub-models for land, they have been evolving over time. So when they started being developed in the 1970s, they were relatively simple compared to what they are now. This was a long process of research and development. And as you can see in the right, new processes have recently been added in the last 10 to 15 years. And I will focus on the lateral flow, which you can find in blue in the right. And you may wonder what is lateral flow, and to explain that, we need to talk about soil erosion. So soil erosion is a process, a land surface process, where particles are detached and then moved from their original location to other locations. So this redistribution is called the lateral movement. Erosion is a natural process that has been largely accelerated by human activities since the beginning of development of agriculture. And it can happen can be caused by many ways, mostly by water, wind, and tillage, the first of them being the most common type. It's not only the most common type of erosion, it's also the most common type of land degradation in the world. So if you could group all the land affected by erosion by water and give it a name, it would be the second biggest country with over 1 billion hectares. And it's called erosion by water because it's triggered by rainfall. So this means that when raindrops reach the soil surface, they have enough energy to detach particles, and then the flowing water can move these particles and detach other particles. And here in the left, you can see that there are different levels of soil erosion. So they can start affecting the land evenly, but then this create channels that are called reels, and they can be very deep, so they're called gullies. And in the right, you can have an example of this happening. So in the bottom of the picture, you see that very severe case of gully erosion happening, just to give a concrete idea of what we are talking about. And what's interesting about erosion is that it has intersections with the carbon cycle. So if we take a look here in the left at the summit, where in this figure there's no erosion, we have the plants capturing the atmospheric carbon by photosynthesis and fixing this carbon in the roots. And when that happens, the soil is mixed and there's the formation of aggregates. And these aggregates will protect both physically and chemically the carbon, part of this carbon. So it will be harder for microorganisms to reach and to consume this carbon. Another part will be mineralized and then consumed and respired back to the atmosphere. So you can have the release there. And when we add erosion to these dynamics,
first we have the direct transport of this organic carbon. So the topsoil is very rich in carbon and it is removed by erosion and moved somewhere else. So from the perspective of the Hughes loop, it's a loss. And then during this transport, these aggregates will hit other particles, other surfaces, and then there will be what's called aggregate breakup. So the physical and chemical protection is now gone, and the carbon can then be consumed and respired back. So this increased mineralization that can lead to more loss of carbon in the soil. On the other hand, when we remove the topsoil, we also expose the subsurface that is not saturated in carbon. So when we have the input by plants in the subsurface that is not saturated, it will tend to store more than the topsoil that was there before. And this is called the dynamic replacement of eroded carbon, which can contribute to increased storage. And when you go to the depositional area, so this carbon that was previously detached, it will arrive. So from this point of view, it's a gain. And when it arrives, it will bury more carbon and reaggregate the particles. So there will be a gain in terms of protection for this carbon. So we have decreased mineralization due to that. And in some cases, this sediment can reach the water bodies, so river, wetlands, and ocean. And in that case, it's a loss for the soil system because it's a different dynamics of the carbon when it's dissolved like that. So ideally, we want to incorporate these lateral movements in land surface models, but there are some challenges for that. And the first of them is the challenge of scale, because when I talk about the detachment of particle of these erosion processes, we are talking about a very, very fine scale that happens in terms of millimeters. While these models, they are more something that you find in the right scale, like representing the global dynamics of this of the system. So ideally, we want to be very realistic with these erosion models, but there's also a challenge of this discipline. That's the amount of observations, because it's very hard to observe sediments through a long period. And also, if we take a piece of deposited material from here, not always we can know where it came from, only if we use tracers or it has a very specific composition of this material. And of course, for this discipline, it's very important that the more details that we have, the more computationally intensive are these calculations. And as I will show to you later, this is important. This was important issue in our attempt to model it. So the figure is just to represent that ideally we want to move from the right to the left to gain realism. But for that, we also need more data and we also have more complex models. So it's a trade-off. And here I wanted to show you how researchers have dealt with these trade-offs, because we see many approaches in the literature that they model this relationship. So in this case of Wang et al., for example, they worked at a global level and they had the full carbon cycle be simulated, so all the microbial activity, everything. But to do the lateral movement, they use a simplified, they define these virtual catchments, which are computational artifacts. And just to give you an idea what is that, is if we were in Europe, it's like France is sending sediments through Germany, but there's no movement inside France and also not inside Germany. So it's a simplified way to have some movement, but not very detailed. I think in the opposite part of this scale, we have the work of Borrelli et al. At the continental level for Europe, where he had the mechanistic carbon displacement. So it was a function of the terrain, of the land cover, of rainfall. It was a very high resolution, 100 meters. But there was no carbon cycle being represented. So in that case, they knew that the subsoil was being exposed. They knew that there was deposition, but that was not affecting any microbial activity, nothing like that. And in the middle of that, I put the work of Chapelle, which also is at the global level. And in his case, he calibrated the lateral movements for Australia, where data was available, and then extrapolated this for the globe. So this is a way to deal with the lack of data that's inherent to this discipline. But also, of course, we can wonder whether this is realistic in some cases, because this extrapolation may be good in some areas, but not in others. And again, just to give a concrete idea of what we mean in these models, you have this picture taken from our work by Ugato in 2016, where you can see the amount of carbon being eroded in the agricultural land in Europe. And you can see that it affects all the agricultural land, but in different ways. So the green area has been not so severe event, but in some places like Italy and south of Spain can be more relevant. So in this sense, there is the CDNN model, which we used in this in our PhD. And it's different from the other approaches because it couples erosion processes, which are called ETD for erosion, transport, and deposition, and the land surface models in a dynamic way. And by that, I mean that when we change the land surface model, we also change the erosion dynamics. And when we change the erosion dynamics, we change back the land models. So there are feedbacks between them. And CDynam has vertically discretized soil profile, as you can see here in the left. So it can simulate the exposure of subsurface. It can also simulate the deposition of material. In erosion is driven by climate, land cover, and terrain. So it tries to be realistic to know that erosion and these processes happen different in different areas. These are the drivers, let's say. However, the problem that we found when we tried to apply CDynam for Europe is that there were limitations for the application of at a large scale. I will talk more about this later, but I think this leads us to the objectives of our thesis. So using CDynam, we wanted to improve the biogeochemical modeling of erosion, transport, and depositions in order to assist decision-making across European member states. And to reach this general goal, we divided in 3 specific ones. So the first one was to propose an alternative formulation for CDynam to allow the upscaling of its calculations to the continental level in Europe. The second one was to generate the first satellite-based map of cover crops in Europe. I will explain to you why this is relevant in this context later. And third, we wanted to evaluate the effects of cover crops on the soil carbon stocks and also how they affect the export of carbon to the oceans. Just a second, I need some water. So now we go to, sorry, this. So this is how the thesis is structured. So in the first work, we worked in the mathematical development of CDynam, because as I said, there was this problem to upscale it to Europe. We also try to generate the harmonized inputs because as we have these feedbacks, it's good to have both being driven by the same drivers, let's say. And also we worked on the physical representation of erosion in CDynam, but we could not finish it. So you can see that we continue this in the third work later. In the second work, we focused on the generation of data because we wanted to incorporate cover crops there. So it's a new process that we wanted to have. And also in work number 3, we developed policy scenarios for the application of cover crops in Europe, and we could use the models then to calculate the impact of this scenario. So going now to the works, to each of the chapters. The first of them is called Matrix Representation of Lateral Soil Movements, Scaling and Calibrating CDynam at a Continental Level. It's currently published and it focused on the first specific object. So now I can explain to you about the computational complexity. So imagine that this drawing here is a piece of land, and in the top you have the high areas, and in the bottom you have the low areas. So if we have erosion in the top, then in this case it's driven by gravity, the movement. So the particles would go from the top to the bottom. And imagine that we take a piece of 9 cells there in blue, and we look at the middle one, which is in blue in that square. So in a model without erosion, we have all the carbon cycle represented there. So we have the photosynthesis and then allocation to leaves and roots, mortality, fire, everything. So you can see that's in an independent unit that we can calculate without more information from the others. But when we add erosion to this, we now have dependence because we need to know what happened in the cells that are above because it's receiving material. And we also need to know how much the current cell will lose and who will gain this loss because now everything is moving, let's say. So in practice, we have these extra red arrows, both in the dynamics and also in the carbon cycle, as you can see. And the implications of that is that when we look at the model without erosion, we can subdivide the land and calculate this in a very efficient way because everything is independent. So we can assign each of these blocks to a different computer and calculate it in okay, it's a very efficient way. But for erosion, we cannot do that because to calculate the blue square, we need to know what happened above. And to calculate the black square, we need to know what happened in the blue. And then we have a cascade effect because we can go downhill and this will depend always on the neighbors above. So it's a non-efficient way and it's a dependent way of processing because nothing is independent anymore, but it's also the only way that we are able to calculate these models when we add erosion. So what we did in this work, first we attacked this computational aspect of CDynam. We wanted to find a way to make it more faster and also require less memory, less computing power, because in the first version, there was no alternative mechanism to offset this gain in complexity that we have when we add erosion. So we were trying to do the same calculations just with extra fluxes. And as a result of that, the runtimes were very long. So just to calculate the initial state, the spin-off calculations, it was taking 2 days for the Rhine Basin only. And as we wanted to calculate this for Europe, which is 27 times bigger, this will take around 2 months if we linearly extrapolate, which is unfeasible. We cannot do that. We can, but it's a waste of time, waste of computing power, of course. And to do that, we proposed this matrix representation of fluxes that makes a link between the land surface models with and without erosion. And first thing is that I cannot show you the full matrix because if we consider Europe, we have over, in this erosion configuration, we have over 5 million carbon pools. But if here we take a subset of 1,000 pools, and then we add them to the rows and columns of this matrix. And each of the points that you see here, the black points, it's a flux between 2 carbon pools. So looking the indexes of these points, we can know who is losing, who is receiving, and how much. And as you can see here, this is the model without erosion. And we have a nearly diagonal structure with 977 fluxes. There are some gaps because there are some ocean cells in this subset that I took, but you can see more or less how the structure looks like. And then when we add erosion, the lateral and vertical movements, in the green and red respectively, we see that we have a much more complex landscape in this matrix, but at least we can represent them in the same way, so we can easily transit between a model without and with erosion. And it's also interesting to see that in this subset of 1,000 pools, before we had almost 1,000 fluxes, and now we have 4,000. So you can imagine that this complexity increases when we have 5 million carbon pools and also bigger basins, bigger watersheds being considered. It's a visual representation of what we did. We also focused on the data aspect. So as I said, these models are now coupled, so we had to have harmonized inputs at the European level. And to do that, we took the best estimates for erosion in Europe that are calculated with external data sets, and we tried to reproduce them using the land surface model forcings. So when we did that, we recalibrated this relationship. We could use these reconstructions that go back to the 19th century to reconstruct erosion in the past. So here what you see in the top left is the reconstructed erosion for 1860. And then we have time steps of 50 years. So in the top right, 1910, 1960 here, and 2010 in the bottom right. So of course, you may be wondering whether this is realistic or not when you compare to the data. So we also compared these to other approaches that we found in the literature. And the red one here, that red line, would be a perfect model. So would be one-to-one relationship. The black one was the data that we used to calibrate this. So it's not independent, but the green and the blue one, they are independent assessments that we found. And even though we don't have a perfect relationship, you can see that it's at least a positive correlation. So we can we consider satisfactory that at least in the right direction, our estimates, they were at least in the right direction. So after doing that, the learnings that we have in this chapter, first, the matrix representation, it allowed us to calculate CDynam at a continental scale because it solved both the processing and the memory requirements. And it did that because it allowed us to subdivide the problem into smaller tasks to facilitate parallel processing. At this point, the physical representation of erosion was not yet complete, so we needed third work for that. So this is the limitation of this first chapter. And for the erosion rates, of course, we had to make a lot of assumptions to be able to harmonize the data sets. But because of the positive correlation with other sources, we consider them good for the use in CDynam. So this was the first chapter, and now go into the next one. It's called From Regional to Parcel Scale, a hard resolution map of cover crops across Europe, combining satellite data with statistical surveys. It is also currently published, and it focused on the second specific objective. So first, you may be asking yourself, what is a cover crop? So I think it's good to clarify. because there are multiple definitions for that in the literature, but all of them circle around this idea of a crop with low economic interest that is planted in winter to reduce soil loss with this particular purpose. And cover crops are relevant because recent changes in the common agricultural policy aim at improving the sustainable measures, and cover crops are often adopted in this context because they may have some environmental benefits like reduced nutrient leaching, they improve in soil structure, they can increase the water holding capacity and also the biological quality of the soil by attracting biodiversity and others. And for our research, cover crops are very relevant because they affect both erosion and organic carbon. So because it covers the soil that would be otherwise bare, we can reduce soil erosion by 15 to 22% by using them. And because it's a new crop, we have higher carbon inputs and we have lower losses by erosion, so we can increase the carbon storage. And here in the right, you see two neighbor plots. That's one of them in the left does not have cover crops, it's only residues that you see. In the right, you have cover crops, so you can see that's very different, one with and without. And because of these characteristics, ideally we want to include cover crops in our models, especially when we have erosion there. But the data for them are scarce. That's it's a problem. And why it's scarce? It's because it's winter, so we have many complications of that. The first of them is that optical satellites that are very well studied, they cannot penetrate clouds, which are very common in winter. And also they need sunlight, and we have less sunlight in winter. So just you can see in the right here that Europe, this is a image by Moody's in February, cold month, winter month. And you see that Europe is almost all white, meaning that it was almost completely covered by clouds in February. So you can imagine that there are not many optical satellite data available for this month. And this is how an optical satellite works. So you have the energy being emitted by the sun. It reflects in the surface of the land, and it goes back to the satellite. But this communication is blocked when you have clouds. So in this case, the satellite would only see the clouds and not what's underneath. There's also self-declarations are also a potential source of cover crop data. However, farmers declare that they have cover crops because they want to receive payment for sustainable measures. And because of these payments, it's a sensible data, let's say, so it's private. Most of the time we cannot access as researchers. And field observations, they are also hard to collect because it's winter, so it's hard to organize campaigns when it's cold and rainy. It also varies in time when cover crops are applied. However, we are lucky enough to have alternatives to that. And the first of them is the use of radar data instead of optical. And they are a good alternative because they are not passive like optical satellites. Instead, they are active, so they emit their own energy against the surface of the land. And they work in longer wavelengths, so they can penetrate these clouds. They are less. The drawback of their use is that they are less studied than optical satellites, so everything is kind of new, let's say. Self-declarations, as I said, they are not available only through agreement if we are lucky enough to have one. And there are the official statistics that are potential source because they are collected in the field, but they are a very coarse scale. So what this means is that for a whole region of France, of Germany, of, I don't know, Spain, we only have one value to represent everything that's happening inside there. So it's a potential source, but not if you need very detailed data about cover crops. So a common practice is to use these official statistics and to allocate them in the land in a simplified way. So for example, if we know that Portugal has 50% of cover crops, then we can just assume that all arable land has 50%. So in the end, we preserve the sum, or we can allocate randomly, again, preserving the sum, but in a random spatial pattern. And as you can see, this is very simplified, and we wanted to see if we could improve this in a way. So just to put everything that we had when we proposed this approach. So we have this coarse statistics from Eurostat for 2016. So for each of these areas, we know what's their area of cover crops for each of these regions. Sorry. We also have the satellite time series data from radar, which we can access. And we also have external data sets where we can filter arable and non-arable land because it's a crop, so it must be in arable land. And we have some conceptual assumptions about cover crops. So we imagine, for example, that the spectral signature of cover crops in Spain is not the same as Norway. So we wanted to combine this in this second work of the PhD. And we did that by proposing a disaggregation model. So what's this disaggregation model? It's a statistical model which combines the data and our assumptions. So we start this model with a random guess. And by that random guess, we generate a map, a random map, let's say, and we compare to this reaggregated information. And then this tells us which direction our guess should go. And we do that many ways until at some point it converges, it does not change anymore. And in that case, we say we have a disaggregated map of cover crops. And we did this at a 100-meter resolution. And then you export that. And of course, when you see this, you may be skeptical about this approach because it's kind of a gain in resolution from using the coarse data. But so to address that, we were lucky to have an agreement with the French ministry from which we could gather 3,000 parcels, 30,000, sorry. And for each of these parcels, we had an idea about the existence or not of cover crops. And then we validated this map that we generated using these parcels. And I will show to you the results of this validation. So what you see here are two box plots, and the vertical axis of them is the predicted fraction of cover crops from our map. And you have three columns. So in the left, with different levels of certainty. So in the left, we think there's no cover crops, but we are not so sure. In the middle, we are a little bit more sure that we don't have cover crops. And in the right, we are very certain that we have cover crops. So when we consider all parcels, you can see that we predict a higher fraction for the third one than the other two. But this considers all parcels, so even the very small ones are there, and they can have mixed satellite signals. So when we look at this same box plot, but consider only the parcels that are bigger than 10 hectares, you see that more clear separation. So we consider this as promising, and we wanted to quantify how different this is, because this visual assessment is also very subjective. So to quantify that, we generate this curve that has a true positive rate in the vertical axis and a false positive rate in the horizontal axis. So a perfect model would reach top left point because it would have 100% true positive and 0% false. And if you remember that I told you about the random allocation, that would be the diagonal line because it's random, so it's 50-50, we don't know what's happening. And the blue line refers to the performance of our model. So as you can see, it's closer to the perfect line. And we can also quantify how close is that by calculating the area under this curve. So for the perfect model, we would have an area of 1. And for our model, it was 0.74, which according to the literature was considered good. So yes, this looked promising for us. And then we wanted to know if this varies in France. So we subdivided France into 5 regions. And we found that for 4 out of these 5, the west, north, east, and center, they were also higher than 0.7, so good. And for the south, it was 0.65, so not so good, but it's also a region that doesn't have as many cover crops as the rest. So it didn't affect the overall result that I showed you before a lot. So just to sum up what we did. So before we had these 2015 polygons with an average covering an average area of 2 million hectares each. And after our disaggregation approach, we were able to bring this information to 150 million cells, each with 1 hectare. And for each of the cells, we have the fraction of cover crops. So you can see the blue pixels represent the higher fractions. And then we have different patterns across France, as you can see in the squares in the right. So the learnings for these chapters, first was that it was a setting with where data was very scarce, but despite this scarcity, we were able to produce this map of cover crops. And we expect that it will be used by researchers and practitioners for simulations that require this detail, the spatial detail of cover crops. Also, as I said, radar data is relatively new. So there was this hypothesis that it could be used for cover crops mapping, and we could test that. We could show at least that it's a reliable source, even if was not the best method because of the lack of observations. And of course, the limitations of this approach is that we could not validate it for other regions because we don't have data. It's not publicly available. And even though the performance was good, it was not very good. So if we go back to this work in the future, there are some changes that we can try to make, some more information to incorporate to see if we can improve it. Now, finally, going to the last chapter. which is called Improving Land Management Representation in a Constrained European Carbon Scheme with Lateral Displacement to the Oceans. It's currently submitted, and it focuses on the third specific objective. So to describe the problem that we address, so when we apply cover crops, we have the enhanced carbon storage, as I said, because it's a new crop that we add. And then we have lower losses by erosion. And in the end, when we have this lateral movement, the sediment will reach the ocean. So we have the export of particulate carbon to the ocean. And if we look at each of these dynamics, we see an opposite outcome for the ocean export. So if we have the enhanced storage only, without considering the reduced erosion, imagine that this brown rectangle is the amount of soil that is removed, and the black one is the share of carbon. So when we have enhanced storage, we have a higher share of carbon. So our black square increases. We have high carbon inputs. So when this piece of eroded material reaches the ocean, we have high carbon export because there's more carbon there. But if we focus on the reduced erosion, then the whole size of the rectangle reduces, and the size of the black rectangle reduces proportionally. So the amount of carbon, the absolute amount of carbon also is lower in this case. And as a result, we have less carbon being exported to the ocean. But in real life, these processes don't happen independently like this. They happen at the same time when we add cover crops. And the goal of this chapter was to estimate what is the dominating effect, which one of these is dominating over the other. And it's interesting that for our thesis, it combines what we did before in the first chapter by incorporating these lateral movements, so we can represent more realistically this movement into the ocean. And also we could use this spatially explicit cover crop map to help us here. So going to the results. First result is the effect of erosion in the soil carbon budget. And the circles represent the export of carbon to the oceans. And as you can see, this is not an equal distribution. We have some outliers here of areas that export more. So in total, we have we calculated 1.95 teragrams of carbon per year. And we found it's a concentrated pattern, mostly happening in Great Britain, Italy, Greece, the Balkan states, and the south of Spain. The others are contribute less to this total of 1.95. And this was interesting just to characterize the phenomenon that we were working. And we also, as I said, because of the forces that we have for the 19th century, we could calculate this for these 150 years. And then we also wanted to calculate each of those two dynamics that we mentioned before. And the first of them is the carbon storage rate. So this plot shows for different pixels of different shares of cover crops, how much they are able to store due to the addition of cover crops. And we assume that this addition stops after 10 years. So it reaches a maximum, the area of cover crops reaches a maximum of 10 years. And it's interesting to see that our model simulates again, even after that, and a peak after these 10 years of 1.3 per mil per year, which we can compare to the policy initiatives, for example, the 4 per mil per year. And this tells us that cover crops can contribute to them, but they are not sufficient alone. Even when we have a lot, we only reach 1/3 of this target. And it's also interesting that when we look at the same plot for the ocean outputs, we also have a maximum like this one, but it happens after 13 years, not 3. And this, not 10, sorry. So this 3 years difference, we can say that is because when we change the length, there's a delay until the particles reach the ocean. So the ocean output is more resistant to the land cover change than this increases storage. It's a coherent result that we could have with C dynamic. So now to answer the question that we have in this chapter, I present here two of the scenarios that we created. And here's the first one where we have erosion enabled, but no cover crop. So you can see the field is bare. And in that case, and the other one is a theoretical cover crop application. It's where we have almost 10 times as we have now. And as you can see, the model was able to simulate an increased litter inputs due to the addition of cover crops. And also all the fluxes were affected. So erosion reduced when we have cover crops. But we were focused on the ocean outputs because, as I said, we have these two opposite dynamics. And what we found is that when we add cover crops, the ocean output tends to decrease compared to when we don't have cover crops. So this told us that when we consider the enhanced storage and the reduced erosion, the reduced erosion tends to be more relevant by reducing the final output that we observe. So the learnings of this chapter was that cover crops can increase these carbon stocks even their application reaches the maximum, as I said, at 10 years. They also have a relatively low impact to the 4 per meal initiative, meaning that it's good if you could combine them with, it's good to adopt them, but it's also good if you could combine them with other measurements, such as reduced tillage, conversion of marginal land, and others. From the perspective of ocean export, the reduced erosion is more relevant than the enhanced storage that we have with cover crops. And as an overall learning of our work, we believe that the explicit representation of carbon movements in the models help to reduce the bias of confounding effects. So if we wanted to calculate this with a model that does not represent the lateral movements, probably other dynamics would appear. So last slide, the limitations is that despite the advances that we made in these, advances there, CDynam now can only run on an emulator of the lens model, which means that we can represent the fluxes, but in an indirect way. So further work is needed for a complete coupling of the transfer module with Orchidea or Daysync or others. No nutrients are yet represented in the model, so we know that cover crops affect the nitrogen cycle, which in turn affect the carbon cycle, and for the moment we don't have that. We also don't have the representation of erosion in the different soil fractions, because we know that light fraction tends to be eroded more easily, for example. We also don't have the aggregation and disaggregation of particles, so that is being, again, represented indirectly. We also don't represent rivers and the conversion from particulates to dissolved organic carbon. Also, we don't have the sediment trapping by dams. So there are many points of CDynam that we can improve in the future. We also know that there are other management factors, such as residues, tillage, that have similar challenges as cover crops for mapping, and that are not yet represented, so maybe something to do in the future. And most importantly, CDynam does not represent the feedbacks on the productivity of crops. We know that can affect greatly the results, but when we were thinking about this, we thought that this could be a sensible subject that would demand work by itself, so we left for further work. Okay, it's the end. Thank you.